A few weeks ago in adult education, we were talking about controversies surrounding the Bible in the early church. Now, we were supposed to be talking about controversies in the 16th century, but as many of you have learned about me by now, whether I'm preaching, teaching, or leaving you a voicemail, I sometimes take a while to get to my point. So like I was saying, when it came to the Bible, one of the biggest problems the early church faced was something that all three of our readings have in common today. The problem, for many, was that so many of the figures in the Bible were, well, not all that great. Take, for example, in the passage from Timothy, where Paul reminds us that Jesus is descended from David. In the Jewish world, that connection did wonders, but to a Greek audience, David was one of the most troublesome figures of the Old Testament. For those of you who need a little bit of a Sunday school refresher, David is easily the most important king in Israel's history, but he made some unsavory choices. Most notably, he slept with and impregnated a woman named Bathsheba while her husband Uriah was away at war. Then David put said husband on the front lines so that he could marry the now widowed Bathsheba and hide the illegitimacy of the child. So, to connect Jesus to David gives him a royal lineage, to be sure, but not a particularly holy one. And do you want us to believe that he is the Son of God? People asked the early Christians. And then, of course, we have Naaman, the Syrian general. At every turn, Naaman shows himself to be a fairly despicable person. He is a leader of armies and wars of conquest. He learns of Elisha only because he has taken slaves as plunder from Israel. He throws a fit when Elisha doesn't put on a good enough show to be a prophet for him. And he looks down on the River Jordan, where Elisha tells him to take a bath. And yet, against all expectation, God heals Naaman. And though Naaman shows some signs of contrition, at the end of the day, he goes right back to Syria. And in a few years, when Israel is at war, he is probably the one commanding armies against them. And this is the one God in which we are supposed to believe, people asked the early Christians. Lastly, we have the 10 lepers from our gospel reading today. Jesus says that their faith has made them well, but they show precious little of it. All 10 were healed as they went on their way to the priests. Yet only one returns to give Jesus thanks. And this is what it means to have faith, said those prodding the early Christians. So, what are we to make of all these mediocre people who have found their way into what we call a holy book? I'm going to say that we are about 2,000 years into asking this question, and it's not gotten any easier to answer. Now, maybe they're there, and don't take this the wrong way, but maybe they're there to make us feel a little more relatable to the people we read about. After all, we can be sometimes a little mediocre ourselves, can we not? Now, I'm guessing that none of you has ever murdered someone to cover up an affair, but I think that all of us would be hard-pressed to say that on any given day, we have been paragons of virtue. Who can fault the Bible for having a cast of characters that is, well, human? This is a start, but it's not quite satisfying, is it? After all, there are people all around us, and we don't need King David to get us good human drama when we have daytime TV. More than this, shouldn't the message of God be something told by heroes and saints? aren't we meant to be inspired by those better than us, rather than confused by such misfits as David, Naaman, and these 10 lepers? The question posed to us today is the same one behind those early challenges to Christianity. What is so special about these events? What is God saying to us that God would tell us in this way? The key to understanding these stories is that the story of God's love for us cannot be told through the lives of heroes or knights of virtue. No, first and foremost, the story of God's love must be told through the lives of broken and battered people, like those we hear about today. For only in this way can we hear and believe that God's love is for us, just as we are. Were we to hear of God's love as a heroic epic, we would think that the love of God was something for us to achieve or aspire to. We would start planning out our training montages and writing our acceptance speeches. But God does not love us because we are acceptable, desirable, or righteous. No, God loves us in order to make us acceptable, desirable, and righteous in God's sight. And it is for this reason that again and again God shows a heart, not just for the poor, the broken, and the needy, but for all the people who seem to want and deserve God's love the least. That God heals faithless Naaman and the 9 lepers who do not turn back should be the greatest comfort for us. It won't even be a question of whether or not we are faithful. For through them, God reminds us that it will never be a question of whether we are good enough for God. As Paul boldly proclaims, if we are faithless, Christ remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. With these words, Paul puts an end to our wondering of whether or not God's promises come with strings attached. Instead, he reminds us that faith is not the currency with which we earn God's favor, but rather that it is God's good favor to work faith in us where it is lacking, giving us new life whereby we can love one another as Christ first loved us. This work God began for us in baptism, and fittingly so. For whether we went into those waters at 9 days old or 90 years young, we will never have seen enough to expect what God has in store for us. Our future and God's plans for us are a mystery more often than not. Yet the one thing that matters is the one thing that God says clearly. If you have died with Christ, you will also live with him. This new life is still to come, yet it is already here for us today. For each day anew, God promises to be with us, patiently and tirelessly, until this new life in us is accomplished and complete. In turn, we are set free to see one another not in the light of our shortcomings and failures, but in the light of a God who has called us all beloved and wills that none be left behind. For just as no one is beyond the reach of God's mercy, so too ought our willingness to bear with one another never be restricted to those who have first proved themselves worthy or deserving. To love like this is, of course, a daunting task. But so great a love is commended to us, because so great a love as God's goes with us every day. And when we feel we lack it, when we are overcome by the concern of whether we have faith enough for God, we remember that the faithfulness of Christ is always there to sustain us. And that like David, Naaman, and all those nameless people who had but the smallest shred of faith, God looks on us still through Christ's tinted glasses and calls us his own. For such wondrous love